immediately classified as a racist, which means the more people are then perceived as racist, and therefore further division.
Well, he's under so much scrutiny that he can't even walk gingerly down a ramp wearing his shiny leather-soled shoes without being criticized of potentially having Parkinson's. I don't know if you saw that. Now, if anyone who wears leather-soled shoes, especially when they're new, and let's face it, his shoes are likely to be new, and you then walk on a shiny surface, you know that that's a high-risk proposition, to say the least. So if you have a portly mid-70s man who's been standing for a period of time, walking down a ramp with his leather-soled shoes, I think he did pretty well to walk gingerly and carefully down without slipping up.
That's typical CNN and MSNBC, and the glaring holes of fake news that they represent. And in fact, I think the BBC in some ways are actually going down a similar path, and I'm not impressed.
That said, his advisors should have advised him to wear rubber-soled shoes,
rough up his leather soles.
That's it. But I said I'd mention why people tend to remember the good things about people after they've died. And I've done a lot of research on this, and there's no compelling explanation. And therefore, I'll give you my take. So first of all, with statues and idols, then clearly people will remember what suits them. If you idolize someone, then you will remember exactly what suits you for that person. So memory is highly selective. But then, of course, when the average person dies, for instance, I don't know whether you remember the sketch by Not the 9 O'Clock News, when there were two politicians going hammer and tongs against each other during an interview. And at one point, one of them, right in the heat of the moment, collapses from a heart attack. And the other person was just about to say, this is the type of person who will be sorely missed. A close personal friend of mine. And of course, what I suspect what that is simply the fact that the brain does anything to avoid anxiety. So we remember good things with preference to bad things, because it's simply not pleasant to remember bad things. And you can take that to the extreme of post-traumatic stress disorder, where the brain will actively block the person trying to recall and process the trauma, which leaves them in a hinterland of ongoing stress.
I'll challenge you just for being devil's advocate, because I'm not doubting you. But because the thing is, when you actually have a negative experience and things like this, it actually creates a rise in cortisol, as opposed to a positive experience, which creates a rise in dopamine. Mm-hmm. Now, dopamine stays in your system far less than cortisol does. So cortisol lingers a lot longer. If that's the case, why? And that's one of the reasons why political campaigns are very much based on based on negativity. So it lingers into the memory of the public far longer. So that being said, wouldn't it be the case that actually you'll remember the negative experiences far more than the positive ones?
No, you're doing two separate things. You see, the fact is, avoiding a negative outcome is far more powerful a motivator than achieving a positive one.
Okay.
So you're not recalling anything for that. You're simply avoiding your negative outcome. You're avoiding a loss, let's say. Whereas in a memory is different. You just don't want to remember it. And in fact, it doesn't even need to be a trauma. So Professor Pennybecker, and I've talked about this before, did studies where simply getting people to talk about difficult experiences in the past, write it down, to write down and write about difficult experiences in the past, improved their mental and physical health, their heart, their cardiac status improved, because what happens is it's only really healthy to be able to look forwards in life. Looking back means you haven't been able to process things. And if there are difficult experiences you haven't processed, you've got this constant little drip of cortisol, which is a horrible poison for the body, which rides around the body like the Grim Reaper, wreaking havoc wherever it settles. And therefore, if you're able to give yourself calmness,
nice analogy.
Thank you. If you're able to give yourself calmness, then that will increase your health, and you can then follow it to what I always say, that humans want contentment, not ecstasy. You see, modern life and materialism makes us think that we need to be seeking the ultimate, i.e. ecstasy, but what we really, really want is contentment. And that simply means being able to process. Now, of course, the only time that is perhaps reasonable to be looking back on your life is towards the end of your life, when you can start reminiscing about things. But then, of course, by definition, you are at the end of your life, and you probably know you are.
You know, I was having an interesting conversation with my daughter who, funny enough, something along the lines you were saying a little bit earlier, where she was almost calling me hypocritical, actually. And we were talking about, actually, do you separate the person from the talent? And we were referencing sort of Kevin Spacey. Do you actually separate the fact that he was actually a talented actor to the person who did all those horrible things? And which means was, actually, would you then stop watching all his movies because of what he's done, or would you watch them based on the talent? And we also talked about, you know, how, because I think they were talking about taking awards away from people and things like this, like, you know, Michael Jackson, who was an incredibly talented actor, talented singer, as opposed to the things that have been, you know, sort of said about him or alleged that he has done. And because there's certain people I don't like, because I found them quite hypocritical. And at the same time, actually, what do you think? Should you separate the talent from the person, or do the two go hand in hand? And if they've done something wrong, they should be vilified together. Because in some ways, when we talked about Winston Churchill earlier, actually, you could say he was a racist. But on the other hand, his talent as a wartime leader, which is the best way to describe him, should that enable him to actually hold on to that legacy, I suppose?
Well, don't forget, he wasn't necessarily that liked. They got rid of him pretty quickly afterwards, didn't they?
1945, they got rid of him, yeah.
So that's something to remember.
But he also came back in 4 years after that, I believe, didn't he?
Yes, I don't know whether it's 4 years, but I don't know the reasons for that. Nostalgia, perhaps. I don't know. But I remember one of my patients saying to me that he really, really disliked a particular therapist, but he knew he was good, so he had the discipline to choose him as his therapist. And of course, what that means is he separated his dislike from the therapist's talent, because he knew he'd benefit from the talent. And I can tell you, from treating very successful people, when I say successful, I mean stratospherically successful, or grade A celebrities who've been my patients. These are normal people who have a very focused talent, incredibly normal people. You know, you would expect them. You see, it's the halo effect, isn't it? Just because someone's good at one thing, you suddenly start hoping or expecting that they'll be good at everything else. And as I tell some of my patients, just because someone has a great role for you in one aspect of life doesn't mean they'll be able to fill other roles successfully, and you'll just end up being disappointed. So always play to people's strengths. So sheer talent can be very, very focused. It can have a very narrow bandwidth, and therefore if you say, can we really separate? Well, the answer is, it depends on how bad the bad thing is.
That's true, because if you actually, for example, I'll interrupt, because you can use like Jimmy Saville as an experience, who actually had his knighthood taken away from him in the end. Because of that. Now, I didn't consider him particularly talented when I used to first see him at the beginning. But when you take something like that, actually, he's just another, he's just another person that should be forgotten. And actually, you could say the same about Hitler, who was infamous. Was he talented? Yeah, he was a talented speaker. He was a talented speaker enough to actually get enough people on his side and on his vision to be able to go, to almost attempt to take over Europe in some ways. And
that's further. Right, but quite a mediocre artist.
He was a mediocre artist, but the thing is, that's not the talent we're looking for. But the thing is, I mean, he's not going to be forgotten because he's obviously he's cemented in history. But the thing is, he's never going to be seen in a positive light for his ability as a speaker or his ability as a, as a mediocre artist.
But you see, the importance of him is history and what to avoid, and indeed how people, the circumstances which gave ground fertile enough for him to flourish. And of course, it was the Great Recession and banks foreclosing on their loans to Germany that ended up in him flourishing.
Of course, but as I said, so the thing is, I think it would depend on the level of what they've done personally. And I think you also got to take the time, I think you also got to take into context the time in which they were living, because I mean, a lot of people would say that, Alexander the Great was, was an incredible leader, but I'm sure he's done a few things, if you actually looked at history, that actually today would not be accepted or tolerable.
Undoubtedly so. In fact, it was quite interesting looking at Oliver Cromwell. Now he's actually, they use the term father, founding father, and talking about opportunism, talking about ability. He was a relatively middle grade, mediocre farmer. That's what he was. But he came from a family with connections to Parliament, so he had access to Parliament. And Charles I at the time kept on irritating everyone by dissolving and recalling Parliament, but only recalling them because he wanted to raise taxes, which started irritating everyone. And then you got the parliamentarians deciding to wage war against the loyalists. And it just so happened that Oliver Cromwell thought that mounted cavalry were far more efficient and effective than foot soldiers. And his observation of that led to and the concentration that led to one of the successes of the parliamentarian soldiers. And indeed, he was appointed head of the army at one point, despite the fact he had no experience whatsoever. He just had raw talent, natural aptitude. And indeed, it was his aptitude that led him to being effectively crowned king. Of course, it wasn't king in name. He was, what was it, Lord Protector, I think. And yeah. And the point to make there is he, although he was the father of Parliament, i.e. democracy, he had to run the whole country for a year as a dictator, a military dictatorship, until he really couldn't keep it up. He also, as part of one of the 3 British civil wars, was responsible for killing 25% of the Irish population, which is one of the reasons they want to topple a statue.
Well, yeah, exactly.
And yet the founding father of Parliament and democracy in the UK so you can see the push and